I sat on the polished floor of my sister's wedding hall, holding my 8-month pregnant belly as more than 100 guests watched in complete silence. My own father, Thomas, stood over me demanding the $50,000 trust fund that my late husband and I had saved for our unborn son. All because I refused to give away my baby's future so my sister, Amber, could have the luxury life she wanted. As I looked around the room, I realized something had just happened that would change every one of our lives forever. And before the day was over, a truth no one saw coming would leave the entire hall speechless. My name is Evelyn. If you had met me a year ago, you would have seen a woman who genuinely believed that the world was a fundamentally good place, and that no matter how dark things got, your family would always be the safety net that caught you. I am a graphic designer, a profession I built from scratch through sleepless nights in a tiny apartment in Seattle, Washington. I loved the structure of my life, the predictable lines of my digital canvases, and the quiet comfort of the rainy Pacific Northwest. But more than my career, my entire universe revolved around my husband, Mark. Mark was an architectural draftsman, a man whose hands were always stained with graphite and whose eyes lit up every single time I walked into the room. We met at a small coffee shop near Pioneer Square on a pouring Tuesday, and from the moment he offered to share his umbrella, we were inseparable. We were married 3 years later in a simple, beautiful ceremony by the Puget Sound. Our love wasn't loud or boastful. It was steady, kind, and deeply protective. We built a beautiful life together in a modest 2-bedroom townhouse, saving every spare dollar we had because we knew exactly what kind of future we wanted to build. 6 months ago, our lives felt completely perfect. I was sitting on our living room rug, surrounded by swatches of pale yellow paint and half-assembled flat-pack furniture, when Mark walked in with a massive, boyish grin on his face. I was 24 weeks pregnant. It had taken us over a year of trying, a year of quiet heartbreaks and negative tests, but finally, our miracle was happening. We were expecting a baby boy. That evening, Mark knelt on the floor, pressed his warm forehead against my stomach, and whispered to my belly, promising that he would spend every second of his life making sure our son had everything he could ever dream of. I looked at Mark's gentle face and felt a profound sense of peace. I had spent so much of my youth feeling untethered, unloved, and cast aside by the people who were supposed to cherish me. But with Mark, I had finally found my real home. We spent hours that night talking about names, about the schools he would go to, and how we would teach him to ride a bike along the Alki Beach boardwalk. We were just ordinary people deeply in love, completely unaware of the shadow that was creeping up on us, and utterly blind to the fact that the people who shared my DNA were watching our happiness from afar, waiting for the perfect moment to tear my world apart. To understand why my family did what they did, you have to understand the dynamic I grew up in. In the household run by my father, Thomas, and my mother, Maria, there was a very strict, unspoken hierarchy. At the very top sat my younger sister, Amber. Amber was the golden child, a girl whose whims were treated as royal decrees. If Amber wanted new clothes, the family budget was rewritten. If Amber failed a class, it was the teacher's fault. I, on the other hand, was the designated giver, or more accurately, the ghost who was only noticed when they needed an ATM. When I worked 3 jobs during college to avoid debt, Thomas didn't praise my work ethic. He demanded I pay for Amber's spring break trips because family helps family, Evelyn. When I started making a good living as a graphic designer, the pressure only intensified. I remember a specific dinner 3 years ago when Thomas called me out of the blue, demanding $8,000. Amber had crashed her car, and instead of making her face the consequences, Thomas wanted me to buy her a brand new sedan. When I hesitated, Maria took the phone, crying, telling me I was a cold, ungrateful daughter who was ruining her sister's life. I wrote the check just to make the screaming stop. But the moment the check cleared, the phone calls stopped too. They didn't invite me to Thanksgiving that year. They only saw me as a source of revenue. When I married Mark, he helped me draw boundaries. He showed me what real love looked like. A love that didn't come with a price tag or a guilt trip. Together, we decided that our hard-earned money would go toward building a fortress for our own future family. We opened a specialized high-yield trust account. Over 4 years of tight budgeting, packing lunches, and passing up luxury vacations, Mark and I meticulously saved exactly $50,000. We locked it away. It was a strict, untouchable trust fund specifically allocated for our child's future healthcare, college tuition, and security. We called it our Peace of Mind Fund. Somehow, through my mother's constant prying and casual questions during our rare, brief phone calls, they found out about the money. Maria had asked how we were preparing for the baby, and I naively mentioned that Mark and I had secured a $50,000 trust fund, so our son would never have to struggle the way I did. I could practically hear her calculating the numbers through the receiver. Within days, Thomas called, dropping hints about how Amber was looking to buy a condo and needed a down payment, suggesting that since I was doing so well, I should do the right thing as an older sister. Mark stood firmly beside me. For the first time in my life, I told my father no. I told him that money belonged to my unborn child and it was entirely off limits. The reaction was explosive. Thomas cursed at me, calling me a selfish, stuck-up brat who had forgotten where she came from before slamming the phone down. From that day on, the silence from my parents and sister was absolute. No texts asking about my pregnancy, no check-ins, nothing. They completely cut me off, treating my refusal as an act of treason. I thought that was the worst they could do. I thought their rejection was the ultimate punishment. But I had no idea that their greed was a disease and they were simply waiting for me to be at my absolute weakest before they struck again. The rain in Seattle has a way of washing everything out, blurring the lines of the city into gray streaks. It was a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 2 months after I had stood my ground against my father when my entire life was violently erased. Mark and I had spent the morning at a boutique baby store in Bellevue, picking out a wooden crib and a set of tiny cotton onesies. Mark insisted on driving. He held my hand over the center console the entire way back, laughing as he tried to mimic the ridiculous operatic music playing on the radio. I remember looking at his profile, his messy brown hair, the laugh lines around his eyes, and thinking that I had never been safer. We were just 5 minutes away from our townhouse, crossing through a major intersection near the highway off-ramp, when the world exploded. A massive semi-truck, its brakes completely failing as it sped down the slick asphalt, ran a glaring red light. It hit the passenger side of our SUV with the force of a bomb. I remember the horrific sound of tearing metal, the blinding shattering of glass, and the terrifying sensation of spinning out of control. And then, a suffocating, heavy silence. When I finally opened my eyes, the smell of smoke and deployed airbags filled the crushed cabin. I couldn't move. A sharp, agonizing pressure locked my lower body in place. I turned my head, panicking, screaming for Mark. But Mark didn't answer. He was slumped over the steering wheel, his eyes closed. A terrible stillness settled over his face. I reached out, my fingers barely scraping the fabric of his sleeve, begging him to wake up, telling him our baby needed him. But his skin was already turning cold. He was gone. He had died instantly, taking the brunt of the impact to shield the driver's side where I sat. The next few weeks were a blurred nightmare of sterile hospital lights, white coats, and a devastating diagnosis. The doctors told me that while my pregnancy was miraculously intact, the impact had caused a severe traumatic injury to my lumbar spine. I had no feeling from the waist down. I was confined to a wheelchair, a helpless, grieving widow with an 8-month-old belly, forced to navigate a world that had suddenly become completely inaccessible. During the darkest month of my life, as I sat in that sterile hospital room staring at the rain against the window, the silence from my biological family was deafening. I called Thomas. I called Maria. I sent desperate, tear-stained texts to Amber, begging them to come hold my hand, begging them to help me arrange Mark's funeral. My calls went straight to voicemail. My texts were left on read. They knew Mark was dead. They knew I was paralyzed in a hospital bed. But because I had refused to give them my money 2 months prior, they decided to punish me by leaving me to rot in my own grief. I had to bury the love of my life alone, surrounded only by a few sympathetic neighbors and co-workers, while navigating a wheelchair with hands that shook from sheer sorrow. The silence was finally broken 2 weeks after I was discharged. I was sitting in my silent, empty living room, staring at the empty crib Mark had built, when a thick, glossy envelope slid through my mail slot. I managed to roll my chair over and pick it up. It was a lavish, gold-foiled wedding invitation. Amber was marrying Daniel, the son of one of the most prominent old-money real estate families in Seattle. I stared at the pristine white paper, my chest tightening. There was no note inside. No, "I'm sorry for your loss." No, "Are you okay?" Just a cold, formal summons to a luxury country club venue in North Seattle. For days, I wrestled with the sheer audacity of it. But in my grief-stricken, vulnerable state, a small, naive part of my heart whispered a lie. I thought to myself, maybe this is their way of reaching out. Maybe, in the face of a wedding and a new life, they want to put the past behind us. Maybe my father just wants to hold his disabled daughter. With a heart full of desperate hope and a body broken by tragedy, I decided I would go. I would put on my best dress, roll myself into that hall, and try to rebuild the shattered bridge to my family. I had no idea I was walking directly into a trap. The day of the wedding arrived with a bitter, biting wind that swept across the Seattle waterfront. I sat in front of my vanity mirror for over an hour, my hands trembling as I tried to apply a layer of makeup to conceal the deep, dark hollows under my eyes. I chose a loose-fitting, elegant navy blue dress that draped carefully over my 8-month pregnant belly and reached down to cover my useless, unmoving legs. It was an agonizing, exhausting chore just to pull myself from my bed into the cold metal of my wheelchair, but I forced myself through the pain. I kept repeating a desperate lie to myself. They are your family. When they see you like this, when they see your belly and this chair, their hearts will melt. They will remember they love you. I paid an accessible transport van to drop me off at the grand entrance of the luxury country club in North Seattle. The venue was breathtaking, a sprawling estate surrounded by manicured emerald lawns and massive glass chandeliers that cast a warm, golden glow against the dark afternoon sky. Valets in crisp tuxedos hurried back and forth, opening the doors of luxury sports cars and sleek town cars for the city's elite. Daniel's family was immensely wealthy, and it was obvious that Thomas and Maria had spent every dime of their own savings, and likely borrowed heavily, to make this event look as opulent as possible to impress their new in-laws. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I gripped the rubber wheels of my chair and pushed myself through the grand double doors into the bustling reception hall. The room was alive with the sound of clinking champagne flutes, a live string quartet playing softly in the corner, and the low, sophisticated murmur of over 100 high society guests. I felt an immediate wave of suffocating self-consciousness as the gentle hum of conversation suddenly faltered near the entrance. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a contagion. I was a glaring, tragic contrast to the pristine, joyful atmosphere. A lone, pale woman in a wheelchair, heavily pregnant and visibly grieving, rolling into a sea of silk and diamonds. I scanned the crowd, my eyes searching for a familiar face, a warm glance, or an open pair of arms. Then I spotted them near the grand ice sculpture in the center of the hall. Amber stood there, looking undeniably beautiful in a custom white lace gown that must have cost a fortune, her diamond necklace catching the light. Thomas and Maria stood proudly beside her, beaming as they conversed with a sophisticated older couple, Daniel's parents. Ignoring the burning stares of the guests, I pushed my wheels forward, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Amber, Mom, Dad," I called out softly, my voice tight with emotion. They turned. The bright, plastic smiles on their faces vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating disgust. There was no rush of parental instinct, no tears of sympathy for my tragedy. Amber took a step forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked down at my wheelchair, her voice dripping with venomous irritation. "What are you doing here, Evelyn? Look at you. Did you seriously have to drag that pathetic metal chair into my reception hall? You're ruining my perfect wedding aesthetic and the photography layout before the ceremony even begins. You always find a way to make everything about yourself." The words cut through me like shards of broken glass. I looked at my younger sister, glittering in her multi-thousand-dollar lace gown, and then at my mother, Maria, who quietly adjusted her pearl necklace and turned her gaze away, refusing to look me in the eye. The hundreds of guests in the grand hall fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, their eyes darting between my metal wheelchair and my family's icy expressions. Daniel, the groom, stood a few feet back with his parents, their faces tightening with visible discomfort at the blatant cruelty unfolding in front of them. Before I could even swallow the lump of grief in my throat, my father, Thomas, stepped forward. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't ask how I was surviving after burying my husband alone. Instead, he took 2 steps toward the center of the floor, raised his voice so it echoed clearly over the hushed room, and looked down at me with hard, greedy eyes. "I'm glad you could finally crawl out of your house, Evelyn," Thomas said, his booming voice deliberately carrying across the expensive acoustics of the country club. "Because we need to settle family business right here, right now. We all know Mark's life insurance cleared, and we know about the $50,000 trust fund you've been hoarding in your bank account." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd of wedding guests. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. My hands gripped the cold rubber rims of my wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Dad, please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Not here. Mark is gone. This money is locked away for my baby. I'm 8 months pregnant. I can't walk. Don't give me your pathetic excuses." Thomas interrupted loudly, stepping closer, his face flushing an angry, dark red. "Look at you. You are a crippled widow. You're going to be sitting in that chair for the rest of your life, drawing government checks and living off handouts. You don't need $50,000 sitting idle in a bank. But your sister does. Amber is marrying into a respectable family, and she needs to plan a luxury European honeymoon and secure a down payment for a proper estate to keep up appearances. As your father, I am ordering you, sign the transfer papers over to Amber right now. Prove you're actually a part of this family for once." Amber stood right behind him, crossing her arms, a smug, entitled smirk playing on her lips. She didn't look at my bulging stomach or the visible exhaustion etched into my skin. She just wanted the money. Maria finally spoke up, her voice sharp and dismissive. "Just do what your father says, Evelyn. Stop being so incredibly selfish. You don't have a husband to spend it on anymore anyway." As I sat there, pinned beneath the weight of their collective malice in the middle of a crowded room, something inside me snapped. The suffocating grief that had paralyzed my mind for the last 6 months suddenly evaporated, replaced by an intense, roaring, ice-cold fury. I looked at the 3 people who shared my biological code, people who had abandoned me in a hospital bed, who hadn't shed a single tear for Mark, and who were now trying to publicly extort a pregnant, disabled woman to fund a vacation. I wiped a solitary tear from my cheek, my breathing slowing down as a profound, dangerous clarity took over. The naive girl who begged for their love was dead. I looked Thomas dead in the eye, raised my chin, and spoke with a calm, piercing voice that carried to every single corner of the silent hall. "No, I will never give you a single dime. That money belongs to my fatherless child, and I would rather watch this entire family burn to the ground before I give a single cent to fund my sister's sickening greed." The calm defiance in my voice pushed Thomas completely over the edge. His eyes widened, turning bloodshot with an unhinged, violent rage. All his life, he had demanded my submission, and to be denied it in front of the most prominent families in Seattle was a humiliation he couldn't stomach. With a guttural roar, he lunged forward. He didn't see a daughter. He didn't see an 8-month pregnant woman. He only saw an obstacle to the money he coveted. Thomas slammed both of his heavy hands onto the frame of my wheelchair and gave it a violent, roaring shove backward. The wheels spun out of control on the slick, polished hardwood floor. The chair tipped violently, and before I could even raise my arms to protect my belly, I was launched sideways. I crashed heavily onto the hard floor, the impact sending a jarring shockwave straight through my spine. A split second later, a sharp, blinding wave of agony exploded in my abdomen. I gasped, clutching my stomach as a warm rush of fluid instantly soaked through my navy blue dress. My water had broken. I was in immediate, traumatic preterm labor. For a second, the grand hall was completely dead silent. Then, chaos erupted. "Oh my God! He pushed her!" a woman screamed. Dozens of guests scrambled backward in absolute horror. Daniel's father, a man of immense community standing, looked at Thomas with pure disgust, immediately pulling out his phone and yelling into the receiver, "I need police and medics at the North Seattle Country Club right now. A man just assaulted his pregnant, disabled daughter." All around me, guests pulled out their smartphones, their cameras flashing as they captured high-definition video evidence of my father standing over me, breathing heavily, while my mother and Amber stood frozen in terror, not for me, but for their reputation. Within 8 minutes, the grand glass doors burst open. A squad of Seattle Police Department officers alongside a team of paramedics flooded the reception hall. 3 officers immediately pinned Thomas against the ice sculpture, forcing his arms behind his back and clicking the steel handcuffs into place in front of everyone. The guests pointed their phones, recording every second of his public disgrace as he was dragged out of the venue, screaming obscenities. The paramedics gently lifted me onto a gurney, rushing me toward the ambulance as the wedding venue completely collapsed into a nightmare of sirens and flashing blue lights. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and intense, agonizing contractions. But through the pain, I felt a strange, solid armor settling over my soul. That night, under the emergency room lights, I gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby boy. I named him Marcus, after his father. Looking into his bright, innocent eyes, I found the ultimate strength to ensure the monsters who shared my blood were completely dismantled by the full weight of the law. The legal retribution was swift, calculated, and absolute. The King County Prosecutor's Office received dozens of high-definition video submissions from the wedding guests, leaving no room for a defense. I refused every desperate plea deal. Thomas was convicted of first-degree domestic assault and endangering the welfare of an unborn child. Under Washington state sentencing guidelines, the judge showed him absolutely no mercy, sentencing him to 15 years in state prison without the possibility of parole. The financial fallout completely destroyed the rest of them. To afford the massive retainer fees for Thomas's high-profile defense attorneys, Maria was forced to liquidate their entire retirement savings and sell the family home at a massive loss. The marriage was dead before it even started. Daniel's prominent family instantly canceled the wedding and blacklisted Amber from Seattle's high society, declaring they would never align their name with abusive monsters. With no education, no husband, and no home, Amber and Maria were forced to move into a cramped, dilapidated studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city, surviving entirely on minimum-wage retail shifts. They were left with absolutely nothing. Through intensive physical therapy, the sensation in my legs slowly began to return. I sold my Seattle townhouse, took my husband's life insurance and Marcus's untouched $50,000 trust fund, and moved to a quiet, sunlit coastal town in Southern California. Today, as I watch Marcus take his first steps on the sand, I know that my family thought they could break a grieving widow. But instead, they only engineered their own absolute destruction. Sitting here today, looking at how far Marcus and I have come, I realize that the people who are supposed to protect you can sometimes be the ones who want to see you fall the lowest. But life has a beautiful way of balancing the scales, and true justice always finds its way home. I survived the darkest storm of my life, and I rebuilt my world on a foundation of absolute truth and independence. Now, I want to ask you, do you think I did the right thing by cutting them off completely and pursuing the maximum sentence? What would you have done in my place? Let me know in the comments below. And if you learned something valuable from my journey today, please subscribe and hit the bell icon to join us daily. Thank you for listening to my story.